And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly update. I still haven't quite decided what I'm going to start calling this since it's no longer the COVID update, although that is a major talking point that we'll have discussing this evening. Main thing we're going to be talking about is the self-proclaimed communist state that has arisen within 6 blocks of Seattle that is known as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, Chaz. But as always, I want to begin by first discussing where the U.S. national debt is and what the Fed's balance sheet is. The growth has slowed this week as compared to some weeks, but it's still going up. Current U.S. national debt is 26,061,749,000,000 and currently rising so fast I'm not going to say it in the thousands. So we have topped 26 trillion and almost to 26 trillion 100 billion. As for the Fed's balance sheet, that has also slowed for the time being at just about 7.2 billion. However, the president of the New York Fed is currently predicting that the Fed's balance sheet will hit 10 trillion before this recession is over. And I'm going to say that's on the low end of things since they're definitely wanting to lowball it. But the bottom line is, despite what has been reported about job numbers, production is still down. The Fed is still printing money like crazy. And the news cycle has simply shifted from being all about COVID-19, which it turns out actually has an incredibly low death rate, to being all about George Floyd, to being all about George Floyd protests, to now being about this Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where protesters in Seattle have effectively seized control of 6 blocks of the city and declared it a sovereign nation. So before I continue, Filthy, you have anything to say immediately?
I've just checked on US Debt Clock, and it looks like for the first time since I last checked it, which might have been last week, that GDP is actually going up for the first time. I don't know what we can really get out of that. Since the source is the Congressional Budget Office, I'm going to assume, just for the sake of argument, that that is legitimate. I just find it very unusual, especially since we're starting to see, well, to take this stream back to its original topic, that you have a small spike in COVID cases. It's like the headlines are reporting how there's like record spikes in COVID cases in states like Texas. Of course, I happen to be in Texas, and people are absolutely spooked about that. You have mainstream media talking about how this is the fault of the riots, that this is the fault of the lockdowns being eased, how the CDC is recommending that if this continues, that lockdowns need to return. And I'm just thinking, not only did we predict this, I mean, it's not really much of an accomplishment to predict this because it was blatantly obvious to anyone who was paying attention. But you also have, was the spike in cases in Texas? It was like 2.6%. It was nothing. And even then, it's like 2.6% increase in cases that were already going on. I mean, that's well within the margin of error, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, it's worth noting that while the lockdowns were still in place and the various states around the country were trying to open up, mainstream media was screaming at the top of their lungs that if you better not go outside, you better not open your business, no matter how bad you have it, no matter how much your kids are starving, you'd better not do anything because you're going to kill your grandparents and your neighbors. But now all of a sudden, the one thing you apparently can do that COVID has no power over is protesting police brutality. Because so long as you're doing that and you're doing it in the name of protesting police brutality in the name of racial justice, not just police brutality in general, but so long as you're doing that, apparently the spikes in COVID cases don't really matter.
I have noticed that there's been a very significant double standard in terms of that reporting. I mean, it's been that way for a long time, but I'm actually kind of impressed by how quickly that BLM managed to just come out of the woodworks after being completely silent and absent for like half a decade. And then suddenly they got organized. They're organized all over the country. And then suddenly they have a coherent narrative about racism and systematic racism. That's actually fairly impressive, as I was saying.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, certainly police brutality is an important issue. But before we get to that, I do want to discuss the reason I'm so eager to discuss the issue of Chaz is because anarcho-communists have been telling us for a long time that violent revolution against the state and this kind of declaring sovereignty is exactly what they are going for. You can look at any of the main ANCOM channels on YouTube and find videos about this. And although I don't want to step beyond what I can be sure about. I mean, there are those that are asserting that Antifa is primarily responsible for Chaz. There are those that say it's not. Antifa is too disorganized for that. But what is clear is that those that are in charge of having created Chaz claim to be a commune. It's operating under communism. And allegedly, we should be watching this small block of society turning into utopia, where everyone has enough food to eat and everything is peaceful and wonderful and lovely. Among the things that people of this political persuasion have talked about for quite some time, the evil of closed borders. You know, when Donald Trump announced he wanted to build a wall between the border of the United States and Mexico, it was the most progressive among our ranks who cried out how evil and horrible it was that you would want to stop the free movement of individuals from place to place, stop these poor immigrants from coming to the United States where they need our help. They've also spoken quite aggressively against police brutality and the narrative, of course, leading into Chaz and around the United States now has become defund the police. Different people have different meanings when they say that, but at least the most progressive position is, you know, get rid of the police altogether. Don't privatize the police. Don't do anything like that. Just no police at all. And of course, they despise the ownership of private property and believe that all possessions need to be shared in common and that there won't be anyone who takes advantage of this. Well, what are a number of things that have been reported to have already taken place within this district known as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone? One, the homeless people have eaten up virtually their entire supply of food, and remains to be seen how they're going to get more because it's only a 6-block radius. They're really not rich on natural resources and certainly don't have their own bustling economy within the 6-block region. They put up a wall around their zone, which, you know, it's just wooden barriers essentially, but walls nonetheless. They have armed guards checking people's IDs as they come in and out to make sure that no undesirables are entering their little region. And there are unconfirmed rumors that armed individuals are going door to door to people's homes and businesses demanding money for the protection that they're providing to their society. So they have effectively created their own police force, which funds itself by extorting the population. Border wall, police, and they've already got individuals that have completely depleted their resources. And this independent nation, you know, they got a sign saying you are now leaving the United States as you come in, has already taken up 3 of the major positions that they've been renouncing for years. So what do they have to say about that?
What's funny is that I've seen tweets and articles of people replying to this point about how armed guards are going to businesses, to homes, and extorting people for $500. And they talk about like how horrible it is that they use coercion to extort money out of people for their own protection. This is immoral. This is terrible. Oh, and by the way, pay your taxes. I'm pretty sure that these are the kind of people that have no self-awareness at all. And if this is just some kind of very elaborate demonstration as to taxation being theft, well, then I have to applaud them for their cleverness. But since I don't think ANCOMs are really that clever, I have to assume that they've basically faced with the necessity of the kind of society that they seek to implement. But it's not a state, you guys. It's not a state because we said so. Naturally, like what's going on furthermore in Chaz is absolutely hilarious. Within 2 days of basically giving out food for free, their entire supply had been raided by the homeless. They are now completely without food, and the extent of food production basically consists of 2 sources. One, these little farms that are being set up in the parks that have only like a few beans growing, a few bean plants, and you can see like hilarious pictures going about of people basically praying for food. And you also have people on Twitter who claim to be in the autonomous zone who are literally begging for food and supplies. And it's absolutely hilarious. I would think that one of your first goals, if you're trying to establish an autonomous zone, is to, establish supply lines, trade routes, or at the very least have some kind of supply that you could otherwise ration before before you can actually begin production. And speaking of production, you would need you would need seeds set up beforehand. You would need all this parallel infrastructure all ready to go, or at the very least, supplies set up to allow you to survive as you set up your infrastructure. But no, they didn't do any of that. They just kind of imagined that as soon as the Seattle Police Department abandoned their East Precinct, that everything would be fine and dandy and perfect. Well, the fact of the matter is, like, whether or not that's actually going to be the case really does not look that likely, because not only do we have that food supply problem I talked about earlier, but some of the solutions that they decided to come up with are absolutely hilarious. I mean, there's a video by Tim Pool not long ago showcasing that one of the solutions they come up with is literal racial segregation. They have one of those little pathetic farms ringed around with a fence, and on it is a sign that says, "This farm is for black people and their plant allies." I'm not reading it, but that's what I recall it saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it's absolutely hilarious the extent to which these people who claim to be against racism are actually starting to embrace racism again. Tim Pool then later in that same video showed a speech in the autonomous zone where some guy who's clearly race mixed asked white people to give a black person $10. Just a black person.
Yeah, funny how they're so against racism so long as it's white. Well, they're only really against racism if it's white on minority racism, but that doesn't include Asians or Jews because they're too successful.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now, perhaps even funnier is this one Reddit post from the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone subreddit, in that one of the proposed solutions for helping to get the farm to become more productive and grow faster is to use human manure. Basically, literally using human fecal matter as a fertilizer. And I just can't help but wonder if what's really going to kill them is starvation. I don't know if starvation's what's going to kill them. It's probably going to be plague. I mean, this just sounds ridiculously unsanitary.
Oh,
and I can guarantee you these people have no freaking idea what they're doing.
Exactly. But I mean, I've just got to say, it's always amazed me how ANCOMs insists that an ANCOM society would not have a state, but everyone would simply voluntarily give up their goods to be owned in common. Because now in theory, you could, as I've always said, you could, if you want to have an ANCOM society within an ANCAP society, and every member of your ANCOM society voluntarily joins that society, signs an explicit contract saying that they're going to share their possessions in common and operate under a certain set of rules, that's entirely possible. But if you want to have an ANCOM society where there is no private property and everyone must share all their possessions in common, what do you do when people are unwilling to do so? You're either going to use force to make them share their possessions according to the will of the people, or you're not. If you're not going to use force, then you're in fact an ANCAP. If you are, then you're not. Then you're not an anarchist, which is why so-called anarcho-communism always results in the existence of a state. They just insist it isn't actually a state, even though it's doing exactly what the state they just got rid of did.
Very much so, and it's pretty funny how that's been demonstrated over and over again. You have armed police, which are extorting innocent people for money. You have, I wouldn't be surprised if there's even some sort of legislative body that is already formed. I mean, they already have a warlord, although the rapper whose name I can't recall off the top of my head insists he is not a warlord. But, I mean, I'm very curious as to how this will play out. It very much looks like the Seattle Police Department is being very cagey in their response, and it does not look like the federal government is going to be doing what Trump promised and to send in armed thugs to try to kick them out one way or the other. But I am curious as to how this plays out in the future. I mean, there is a possibility that these people get their act together, that they start actually engaging in some forms of production, or they could just be like the Slab City in California, where they basically just subsist off of other people's welfare payments for eternity.
Hmm. Personally, I'd love to see them just take a hands-off approach and let it collapse into the abysmal state that we know it will. And I mean, then again, let's face it: when all is said and done, the communists will insist that this just wasn't real communism.
Oh, they're already doing that. I mean, when this first started to happen, you had Marxists both in and outside of the Chaz area saying that, yeah, this is a victory for Marxism. This is a victory for anarcho-communism. This is proof that our society is viable and that we can achieve our objectives and blah, 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 blah. But when information started to come out of them having a warlord, of human fecal matter being proposed as a method for fertilizing their fields, for their food being completely out, they're starting to walk back that statement and trying to say like, oh, this isn't proof of the viability of anarcho-communism. This is just proof that, we can achieve revolution or something else.
Mm-hmm. The thing about, and I've talked about this in previous videos before, and I know Filthy has as well, but revolutions cannot succeed in creating in anarchy. A revolution inevitably only creates a different state, because when the armed structures you need in order to stage a successful revolution result in that kind of hierarchy doesn't just go away once you succeed. And history is full of circumstances where armed revolutions, in fact, lead to a state that's even more totalitarian and destructive than the state they overthrew. And I know people like to say, well, what about the United States and the American Revolution? And there is some regards in which you can say the American Revolution is unique, but if you look at the presidency of George Washington, you'll see he was far more totalitarian than most people realize. Washington just happened to be unique in that he was one of the few individuals that was actually willing to willingly give up his power when all was said and done. Most are not, but still, revolutions tend to lead to a more totalitarian state than the one that they successfully overthrow.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like I was actually watching a video asking how Europeans or just foreigners regard the idea of revolution. And there's a very big disconnect between how Americans perceive revolution and how Europeans do. For Europeans, both Western and Eastern, as well as Asians, revolution is not really some kind of, but it's a horrible thing, some monstrous event that always leads to death and destruction in a society that is worse off than that despite the legitimate complaints of the revolutionaries is worse off than when the revolutionaries simply were not in power. Whereas the United States, people, because of what they were taught about the American Revolution, they think that revolution is a good thing, a positive thing, a way to achieve legitimate social change. The question of legitimacy is, of course, dubious, and I'm putting an asterisk in front of that, but I think it shows very much what you're talking about, that the revolution, as we can see from history, and if you have an honest view of history without looking at your own cultural historical biases, is very dubious at best. You're going to end up significantly with revolutions that simply never end, where the people that were in power with the good intentions typically get foisted out by people who want the power for power's sake. And of course, the psychopaths who just want power for power's sake are generally going to be more ruthless, more callous. They're going to do whatever it takes to get what they want, whereas the people who are only using violence as a means to an end are simply going to be ousted, are going to be held back, are going to pull their punches. And when you're in a boxing match and you're pulling your punches against someone who just doesn't care whether you live or die, you're automatically at a disadvantage. So with this in mind, it makes sense that you're going to end up that revolution simply creates a sorting process for the most ruthless, the most murderous, the most violent people in the revolution or in society in general. And those people are generally going to rise to the top to seize power, and it's never going to end the way that they hope. most importantly, because any large system of totalitarian control necessarily always needs an enemy to justify its own existence. After all, the government is a economic firm that provides a service of protection, and if there's nothing to protect society against, then what do people need a government for? As such, there's always some enemy that society is always fighting against. In the Soviet Union, it was, of course, the fascists. They've been fighting the fascists since the beginning. In China, it is very much the American capitalists. Same thing in North Korea. And I'm pretty sure those of you who read 1984 remember that it was, oh crap, what was the other country's name? There was Oceania and there was another one. But basically, that whole region of the world was constantly at war with them, and it was entirely a justification by which they exercised their totalitarian domination over their society. So with this in mind, yeah, the problem with the revolution is that the revolution does not end. You cannot achieve anti-political ends through fundamentally political means. And yes, absolutely, violence is political means because politics is violence. So the fact of the matter is, like, if you're attempting to achieve peace through war, you're not going to get peace.
Indeed. All right, and I guess that brings us to the next topic to discuss, and that is the whole defund the police movement, which allegedly was the basis on which Chaz initially started. But it's not just in Seattle where that's taking place. Obviously, across the nation, starting in Minneapolis, but with many other places now, a mainstream position, particularly among politicians of the progressive persuasion, those that are as far as the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's and Ilhan Omar's say defund the police means, completely get rid of police departments, disband them immediately, and put all the money that was going towards them towards welfare programs. You've got the Joe Bidens and the more moderates of the Democratic Party saying defund the police doesn't mean get rid of police, but it means scrutinize police departments, and those that are found to be engaging in racist or dishonest policies lose their federal funding. And then you've got those on the political right who, of course, are absolutely appalled at the idea that you would want to defund your police because the police are what protects you. The government, the government is dangerous, and we ought not trust it. But the chief agency by which the government enforces its will, the police, they are the one uncorruptible, good and just force in society that we need to maintain, or else all of society will fall apart. So now I want to talk about this because in here there is a legitimate discussion to be had, but of course no one is having it. And I noticed I was grateful to see my video, "The Case for Private Police," has actually seen an uptick in videos in views this week. And of course, I think we should defund the police, but by that I'm not saying get rid of any protection services whatsoever. I mean, stop stealing, extorting money from the citizens, putting it towards a agency that has a monopoly on force and thereby enforces the will of the state and protects the interests of the state as opposed to the interests of the people, and leave protection to be a private matter by which individuals and businesses and communities can hire private protection firms to protect their communities. And then if those firms fail to do so, they can fire them and in favor of a better quality protection firm, which I believe would produce far better societal protection than what we currently have. But that of course is not something anyone's talking about. It's either get rid of the police altogether and allow people to run wild, especially since most of the states where they want to disband police also have very strict gun control laws, and the individuals living in those communities lack the means to obtain firearms and protect themselves from any kind of widespread crime that might result. But sorry, I just lost my train of thought. My point being, defund the police is definitely a conversation that should be had, but it's not being had in any of the contexts that would actually help the situation. Instead, we're discussing either getting rid of the police entirely or increasing funding for police. neither of which will help the situation. And I'm sure many of you have seen there's also broad movement to get rid of anything that portrays police in a positive light, such as movies and TV shows about police, many of which have been pulled from TV stations, streaming services, but not just those kind of shows that you might expect, like Cops and others. But one of the most interesting things I saw this week is how widespread the idea that the children's television show Paw Patrol needs to get removed from television because one of the 6 dogs in that show is a police dog, and it is teaching children positive tropes about police. Now, the reason I find this interesting is I almost made a video. I didn't actually do it, but a couple of months ago, I almost made a video when a Canadian professor alleged that the children's show Paw Patrol is actually capitalist propaganda because the Paw Patrol are supposedly a private service. And in her article, she wrote about how dangerous Paw Patrol is for children because it is promoting capitalist ideas. I started writing a script. I never got around to it. But now, mysteriously, Paw Patrol is not capitalist propaganda because Black Lives Matter and others think it is actually pro-police propaganda. So, what the heck? Quite simply, what the heck?
Well, there's a lot that you said there that I want to reply to. However, I don't know where to start. I guess I can start at the idea of Paw Patrol, and we're kind of seeing this also with other shows like Cops being canceled after 31 seasons. I don't know if this is going to be a thing where they just want it purged from the internet, like thrown out from the archives and just memory hold completely. Since, if nothing else, it's going to be very useful once the state collapses as archaeological and anthropomorphic, or is that right? Anthropological, yeah, that's what I meant. Anthropological evidence of what society was like prior to the state's collapsing. Because as horrible as the institution of police was and is, for all the reasons that we've discussed previously, that they're enforcing unjust legislation, that they're violent, that they're the murderous demographic in the United States by a huge margin, and ultimately their existence is unjustifiable according to Aristotelian deontological ethics, it would still be useful to provide details on how they functioned in their day-to-day life, what was their interaction with people in the time period actually like. So for historical reasons, having shows like Cops and things like Paw Patrol featuring a police dog as a character is still going to be useful historically. So I am, as much as I abhor the existence of police for reasons I have discussed previously, it's still useful to have these kinds of things around. So I'm in a very strange situation in regards to this. Now, the question of privatizing police, I actually think that's a controlled opposition narrative because, well, when people talk about defunding the police, they usually talk about, instead of lowering the tax burden on people, moving that stolen money elsewhere to other departments. I know, for example, one of the demands from Chaz when they released a statement a couple days ago was to have that money moved towards paying for socialized medicine, for government, government education, and a couple other things that I can't quite recall off the top of my head. So, I mean, it's very...
It was the basic social programs that your average progressive wants funded.
Yeah, pretty much. So, yeah. The thing about defunding the police is that it's also implying that the solution to police is somehow going to be achieved through the political system, which ties back to the comments I had on revolution earlier, where you're never going to achieve anti-political ends through political means. By defunding the police, you're necessarily going to try to lobby for support from politicians. Those politicians are then going to attempt to push forward legislation that is operating, hopefully, pushing forward the agenda that you want, which, by the way, you cannot guarantee since you are not a congressperson, you are not a state or city legislature. So whether or not that's actually going to be the case is going to be open to debate. And quite frankly, I am reminded of something Samuel Edward Konkin wrote when he said that towards the end of the state's life cycle, you will begin to see politicians who will run on the campaign platform of vote for me and I will remove the state for you. I think this is very much what we're seeing right now with a lot of politicians, particularly in the cities, who are all operating in support of the defund the police agenda, and it really only began when this whole thing started. So I am very, very, very skeptical, and I have a lot of red flags raised about this entirely. Well, that and all of the dubious stuff that we've seen both surrounding the George Floyd arrest, as well as the dubious stuff regarding the protests and riots themselves. I'm not entirely sure what's going on, but I'm convinced that right now is watch the other hand time. Take note of what the media wants to direct your attention towards, and then look away from it. Look elsewhere. Something else is going on.
Absolutely, and one of the things you can do to notice that is the fact that they were pushing the COVID-19 narrative so hard, and then within a 24-hour period, suddenly that's no longer important. It's all about George Floyd, and now that's no longer important. It's about defund the police altogether, and we're only going to talk about that in the broader narrative of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Unit taking place in Seattle. Meanwhile, what exactly is going on in Congress? What are local governments doing about any of this? Something that most mainstream media outlets aren't talking about at all.
I'm sorry, repeat the question one more time.
Oh, no, there wasn't a question. I was just...
sorry.
Just saying, I was just adding on to what you were saying about how the mainstream media isn't saying much at all about what is Congress currently doing right now. What are the state and local governments actually doing when they're meeting? What bills are they looking to pass? Well, what are they discussing? Have you heard anything in any mainstream media report about that? I certainly haven't.
No,
but you know what's taking place.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, right now I'm seeing a lot of stuff about the second wave is coming. A second wave is here, which we've always known that the second wave is going to be coming. I think I talked about this like 2 or 3 streams ago, where I predicted that since there's data suggesting that a second wave has appeared in every pandemic in American history, or at least every major pandemic, that there's going to be it's going to be assumed that a second wave is going to be here, and it doesn't really matter if there's going to be riots or not, if the lockdowns are alleviated or not. There's going to be a second wave, and you end up with a lot of people just like, oh yeah, I've actually had someone say this to me in real life, where they said like, oh yeah, if we just didn't end the lockdowns, we wouldn't be seeing this massive surge of 2.5% in Texas, even though Texas, with the exception of a couple counties, was never really that locked down.
Oh, and I almost forgot. I should also note that beyond the cop shows and Paw Patrol that they're looking to censor, in the thumbnail for this stream, I also have a picture of Daisy Duke. And the reason for that is the Dukes of Hazzard is also looking at getting censored because the General Lee has a Confederate flag on the top. I'm sure everyone also saw the movie Gone with the Wind was pulled from HBO. Was it HBO's streaming service because of its portrayal of black people, even though it was the first film that a black woman won an Oscar for. So I just thought I'll throw that out there because that is among the other things that the Black Lives Matter movement is looking to erase from history.
I haven't looked into this at all, but I would suspect that Gone with the Wind is now seeing a surge in popularity because of that.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's one of the most rented movie on Amazon Prime.
That's hilarious, and I could predict that because of the Streisand effect. I'm pretty sure we've discussed that before, where it's kind of like the same thing with the forbidden fruit. The moment something gets censored is the moment that people start reacting to that censorship, and people start to watch them because, I don't know, maybe they've heard about it, but they haven't seen it, but so they want to see what the big deal is, and as a result, more people become attracted to it because it's banned.
Mm-hmm. I believe Alex Jones reported that Infowars.com got more hits than it ever had once he got purged from YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely certain that they did that on purpose because, well, let's just say that I don't trust Infowars all that much.
All right. And on that note, just one more thing I got to say about the whole banning Paw Patrol. Again, there's a legitimate discussion to be had about police, defund police, what privatized security services would look like. And I'm happy to have that discussion. But seriously, Paw Patrol is a children's TV show about a 10-year-old boy and his 6 dogs who routinely rescue their mayor's pet chicken. I guarantee you children are not getting pro or anti-police messages from that show.
I mean, in all fairness, there is something to be said about the argument that shows like Cops, shows like CSI. I mean, it's called the CSI effect, where certain institutions, if they're portrayed routinely in the media a certain way, that people will start to develop attitudes about that institution in roughly the same way. And it's basically when you have a whole bunch of shows like Cops that shows them in generally positive lights, when you have shows like Paw Patrol, which features a police dog character who I haven't seen the show, so I don't know what it's actually like. But since it's a kid's show, I'm going to assume that the police dog character is generally a good guy.
Yeah, in doing my research for the previous video that I never ended up making, I watched 1 or 2 episodes. Yeah, they're generally a good guy, but the whole premise of this show is, it's this 10-year-old boy's got his 6 dogs. There's a firefighter dog and a police dog and a recycling truck dog, and little problems pop up around town. The primary one being the mayor, the incompetent mayor. Well, as a side note, the show does teach kids that all politicians are either incompetent or corrupt, because there are only 2 in the show. One's a doofus and the other's corrupt. But the incompetent mayor's pet chicken goes missing, and the Paw Patrol gets called to find it. Or, there's a broken down machine somewhere in town, and the Paw Patrol gets called and they fix it. I mean, it's all very vanilla, children's level. Rescue dogs come and save the day.
Yeah. And of course, as I said before, I do believe that there is a CSI effect going on where police are generally portrayed in a positive light, and all the stuff about them being abusive, them having a very elitist culture, and just generally not being beneficial to people's liberty and people's safety is, of course, going to be ignored. But that said, it's still useful, at least in terms of historical and anthropological reasons. It'll be very useful, especially once the state collapses, to really get into the meat of it, to figure out what governments were actually like during the time that they were around. And how people viewed them and how they were portrayed.
Absolutely. Pumpkin Row, thank you for the super chat, asks, is the autonomous zone a state psyop?
Possibly. However, I have not seen enough evidence to suggest that one way or another. I mean, it is very suspicious to me how hesitant the federal government has been to make good on Trump's promise to just go in there and take it back with military force, and that the Seattle government has largely been leaving them alone, even though they have more than enough military and manpower themselves in their own police departments to be able to pull off a take back. However, whether or not that's just some ideological thing, or it's part of some greater agenda, or they otherwise just want to do something else entirely that is unrelated to any one of those possibilities that either of us have not even considered yet, I don't know. But do keep your mind open, and if there is evidence that comes out that this is, in fact, a government psyop in some way, yeah, keep that in mind. It's entirely possible.
And I would say I have not seen any evidence so far that it's a government psyop. I would say, however, like all such national incidents, the government's not going to let a good crisis go to waste. So between the federal, local, and state governments in Washington, Seattle, and the federal government respectively, I'd say the response to it is definitely, they all have their own reasons for why they're not doing anything about it, and why the mainstream media narratives about this are what they are. So even if it wasn't planned by the state per se, they're definitely going to use it for their own purposes.
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate.
Well, we're at about 40 minutes now. That's actually primarily everything I wanted to discuss this week. So, Filthy, if you got anything else you'd like to bring up, by all means do. And for everyone else, I'll be looking closer at the chat now. And if anyone has any specific questions or issues they'd like to discuss, now is the time to bring it up.
All right. So here's something that's really not too surprising, and it actually is COVID news. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the Discord chat because I posted it there. Colorado bill requires re-education for parents who refuse the COVID-19 vaccine. This was originally posted on shtfplan.com and got mirrored on Zero Hedge. Basically, what's going on is that in Colorado, they're introducing a bill that would make it mandate that would make it mandatory for people to receive the vaccine, and it has zero exemptions, meaning that they're effectively already legislating that the vaccine be mandatory in Colorado. And if you otherwise refuse or you choose to decline, you're going to be required to take a re-education class and must submit a certificate of completion. And that's basically the only way to get an exemption from the vaccine. And I can guarantee you, because we've seen this in location after location after location, in completely unrelated things like driving, where you have to take certain education class, where you're required to take certain education as a requirement for doing something or another, you always have to pay for it. So basically, what's going to be happening is that the state of Colorado is not only going to be indoctrinating you into vaccines being perfect and great and wonderful, and how what's his name? How Bill Gates is nothing but the greatest person ever, and his father was definitely not a high-ranking member of, definitely not a high-ranking executive, or even ran Planned Parenthood. And how Bill Gates is definitely not someone who supports eugenics and population control, and does not have a horrible track record of causing absolute disaster in country after country after country where his vaccines were distributed, including the mass sterilizations, the mass infection of people with polio, mass tuberculosis cases. No. It's all going to be perfect and great and wonderful and good, and if you disagree, we're going to tax you, and that tax is going to be used to get you into an indoctrination course, which is going to be run by our friends.
Yeah, the funny thing is it's even worse than, at least with a driver's license, you can still choose. Now, I would still argue, yes, it's unjust to force people to get a driver's license in order to operate a vehicle they've paid for. But at least you, in theory, can, and there are those that choose not to have a driver's license and not to drive. In this case, you can't even choose not to take the course and not to take the vaccination. You either get the vaccination or you take the course and pay for it, and then probably end up getting the vaccination anyways.
Suffice to say, it's not a very good place, and Colorado is not nearly as free as its legalized weed measures would otherwise imply. So if you're in Colorado right now, I would strongly suggest you would consider moving out of the state, maybe to Wyoming. I don't care. But I mean, this is exactly where we were talking about weeks ago, maybe even months ago, where they're going to put forward a vaccine and they're going to make it mandatory to have it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you're going to go to jail for it. But what it does mean, I mean, right now, the bill as is does not actually ascribe any criminal penalties for not taking the vaccine. However, we know how it's going to work. They're not going to throw you in jail or fine you for not doing so. What they're going to do is make it a requirement for getting a job or getting an apartment or flying on a plane or doing any number of things that the government can otherwise restrict you from doing because, well, they have basically total control over those industries and can basically strong-arm them into doing whatever it is that the government wishes them to do.
Grambo asks, do you think the media narrative of the Chaz is pure anarchism and without government there is no civilization to be successful? I think what you mean is, do I think the narrative that Chaz is pure anarchism and that it is proof that we need government will be successful? Well, I'd say I think it is being successful in that the majority of the population still operates under the belief that government is necessary in order for there to be peace. But I think one thing that is really useful about Chaz is to point out, and this narrative is to point out that Chaz is not an anarchy. And the majority of people who say this, without government, we can't have civilization without government, because if because without government, what would happen is exactly what's happening right now in Chaz. The question you need to ask them is, again, what is a government? What is a state? A state is an organization with a monopoly on coercion and the perceived legitimacy to extort its citizens in order to fund its own activities that are allegedly for its citizens' own well-being. Well, what was going on prior to the establishment of Chaz? What were they complaining about? Police brutality. The police, one of the primary agencies of the state, which is used to coerce the citizens to conform to the state's will, funded by compulsory taxation. They were arguing that it was engaging in unjust police brutality, and they wanted it gone. So they established their society, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And immediately thereafter, a new group of armed individuals starts going around the population, extorting the individuals to give them money in order to fund their activities. What fundamentally is the difference between what was going on before and what's going on after?
I mean, it's kind of funny how a warlord, people pointing out how horrible it is that a warlord appears in Chaz and is even denounced by another warlord named Donald Trump. It's kind of funny to hear him talking about how the SoundCloud rapper is a warlord when he himself is arguably the most powerful warlord on earth.
The only difference is the terms you use. They are both examples of a state. Because the leaders of the one wear suits and ties, and the leaders of the others wear, whatever the classic gangster look is. But nonetheless, they're both operating in exactly the same fashion.
And I'm just replying to something Abolito said in the comments. Yeah, it's the ability for the authors of The Sovereign Individual to predict what's going on right now is actually kind of terrifying. I don't know. Have you read The Sovereign Individual, 2 cents?
I have not, but it's been brought up quite a number of times in these past few streams, so I definitely need to get that on my reading list.
I can give you a PDF if you want.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah, okay. I'll do that really soon. But right now, yeah, it's really strange that they would call it an anarchist society because it's not anarchist at all. In fact, in function, it's indistinguishable from a government, albeit a very organized and more basic government. The only real difference is that the armed thugs do not march in lockstep and the rulers don't wear suits and ties. I bet if the SoundCloud rapper put on a suit and tie, dressed up nice, and got his friends to all march and all start goose stepping, that it would be completely fine. And can you have a PDF? I don't know if I can link it to you yet. Let me just try to get this real quick. Yeah, right now I'm just trying to get the PDF.
All right, awesome. While he's doing that, let me see. JC Armitage asks, do you think voter turnout in 2020 will be at an all-time low? Honestly, that's not something I've looked into, so I can't say. I mean, the mainstream media is trying to push that this is absolutely the most important election ever, just like it was in 2016 and in 2012 and in 2008. And of course, regardless of how hard they push it, doesn't really seem to have that profound of an effect on who actually shows up.
All right, yeah, I just sent you the PDF, and you can probably link it in the comments after it's over. It's available for free, so yeah. And as far as I can tell, it's agorist praxis to be sharing this material for free anyway. So yeah, it's perfect.
Absolutely.
So let's see here. What else has been going on? The petrodollar and the overseas wars. Yeah, I haven't really been looking into it all that much, but it does strongly appear that the dollar is starting to weaken. How quickly that's going to be going and how soon until the dollar dies, I can't say. I don't have that information to make that kind of prediction. And honestly, if I were to give a guess, it would just be a guess. But suffice to say, it's not going to go on for very long. However, I am more and more confident in saying that there is less likely a chance for war, for the simple fact that everyone is so focused on the coronavirus and trying to stop that looks like it's trying to be their main vector for totalitarian control. I think me and Esso on the stream have talked about before how it's very much in the state's interest to provoke wars, how they love having war economies because it's exactly what I was talking about before. It creates a external threat to the people inside that country that justifies totalitarian control over people's lives. It, for lack of a better term, increases the price for the service of protection since it increases economic demand. With this in mind, though, it looks like they're using the coronavirus to achieve this rather than just a foreign war. Now, that doesn't mean war will not occur. I'm just saying it's less likely. There's still a very good chance that China, for example, may attempt to invade Taiwan. I mean, I saw a couple weeks ago that Chinese militants or Chinese military are actually doing drills on a one-to-one replica of the presidential palace in Taiwan, with like every room, the layout being identical, and a good attempt to replicate the furniture, so that their soldiers have a good understanding of the presidential palace. Now, of course, if they invade Taiwan, it means the United States would have to get involved because we have an agreement with Taiwan to, well, not we, but the United States government has an agreement with Taiwan to defend them. And of course, if the U.S. goes to war with China, that's going to be very significant to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be the first really full-scale war since World War II.
Oh, yeah, it'll be absolutely massive. And I don't know if they will or not, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they'll reinstate the draft. I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, people in the U.S. are required, or at least males in the U.S. are required to sign up for selective service, which basically means that they know who you are for the draft. And if they want to institute a draft again, all they have to do is just plug that in again, and boom, people are going to be enslaved as cannon fodder. I mean, you say what you want about slavery during the days of the antebellum South. At least they weren't used as cannon fodder.
Yeah, and with the selective service, in order to be employed in most other jobs, you have to prove that you've registered for the selective service. So the Dodgers and such are pretty much out of luck.
Well, I mean, once you get past the age of 26, if I recall correctly, you're basically completely fine. And even then, like, there are many methodologies you can use to escape the draft. You can, for example, be a conscientious objector. You can have a religious exemption. And given the age of the internet, I can guarantee you information about how to dodge the draft is going to be circulated widely. I mean, I can guarantee you, once this starts, both my 2 cents and I will make videos telling people how to dodge the draft. I will overtly recommend people do this. And yes, you should definitely do this. Do dodge the draft. Hello?
Well, yep, I'm still here. Sorry, I'm reading through the comments.
Sorry?
Grambo says, I fear for Taiwan after what happened to Hong Kong. And it's definitely true that, the Chinese have seized Hong Kong, which we knew they wanted to do all along. They've been wanting to seize Taiwan for quite some time, and as Filthy just pointed out, they're doing rehearsals on how they might go about doing that. So yeah, it's absolutely a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the thing of historical note in regards to Taiwan and China is that during the Chinese Civil War, although the nationalists who were fighting against the communists did outnumber the communists 3-1, they had terrible leadership, they had terrible organization, terrible equipment, and terrible morale, and they literally got driven out to sea and founded the island nation of Taiwan as basically their last bastion. Now, China, in its history, has never recognized Taiwan as a sovereign nation, although the rest of the world has. This international recognition has, of course, been the main driver that has stayed China's hand for as long as it has. Now, whether or not China actually is going to invade, considering the state of their economy and the state of their military, which, although they like to portray themselves as strong, mighty, and powerful, they're military is horrifically trained. Their physical fitness is non-existent. Their equipment is hilariously outdated. Their drivers can't fit into their tanks. Their weapons are absolute pieces of garbage. The only thing that they really have is sheer manpower, which of course is a quality of its own. But given how sophisticated weapon systems are today, I'm pretty sure like horde armies aren't going to be effective as they were in World War II.
Or the one thing I'll say, as someone who's read quite a bit about military history, if you read about the Korean War and the Chinese tactics that were utilized then, yeah, the Chinese military had horrible tactics, but the only thing that really gave them power was the sheer numbers. I would recommend a book like The Last Stand of Fox Company that talks about how just the sheer numbers coming over the hills, completely getting mowed down by the U.S. Marines and everyone else was fighting, but ultimately, just this how their soldiers are getting mowed down, but eventually the enemy runs out of ammunition. If you have enough troops, you can win that way. But warfare has evolved since then, so it remains to be seen how effective that could be.
I mean, if I recall correctly, the Chinese military does not have a joint chiefs, which means that their air force isn't talking to the Navy, which isn't talking to the Army. So that's going to create a whole bunch of hilarious friendly fire situations. If I'm not a military expert by any means, my military expertise is incredibly amateur. But if I were in command or someone important in the U.S. military and I were considering how to fight the Chinese, I would I would do my best to infiltrate their command structure and to instigate as many friendly fire situations caused by their lack of coordination and terrible tactics to try to create as much confusion as I can, while at the same time making sure that my own military is well equipped to fight against human wave tactics, such that the amount of ammunition any position is going to have at any one time is quite frankly overabundant. And even then, you could even just adopt tactics that don't really require holding on to land, utilizing guerrilla tactics would be fairly effective, and just generally trying to avoid holding land at any cost. And if you must hold land, do so in such a way or set your position up in such a way that the sheer losses that the enemy will have to take are so overwhelming that every victory they achieve is going to be a Pyrrhic victory, and you basically just wear them down that way. I mean, sure, the military is absolutely massive, but if they're killing, 10 U.S. soldiers for every 10,000 they lose, you're going to lose the war because morale is just going to be non-existent, because every single soldier is going to be going to battle under the assumption that they are going to die. So, yeah, it's not going to work out well for them, I think.
Isaac Clark says, can't wait for Chad versus Chaz memes. I've actually seen at least one so far.
I haven't seen any.
I didn't look at it very hard, but it was I think it was either in my Discord server or on Twitter. There was someone who made a Chad versus Chaz meme.
Well, that's fitting. So let's see here. Anything else going on that I can't think of right now? I'm sure there's a lot going on, but
there is. We are near the top of the hour now, so thanks for being on, Filthy.
There was one last thing I want to say real quick, and that's to clarify something. I'm not against the idea of autonomous zones per se, creating a region or creating a no-go region in a state where police and just legislation enforcers are afraid to go. I'm not against that at all. It's just that Chaz, at its current point in time, is an absolute joke.
Mm-hmm. And it is, let it live in infamy as proof that anarcho-communism doesn't work. Now, we all know that the communists are, for all of eternity, no matter how many times communism fails, they will always insist that it just wasn't real communism. But get real.
Statism is a religion.
That it is. All right. Well, thanks for being on, Filthy. Thanks, everybody, for checking out the stream. And as always, I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about by the time next week rolls around. So that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.
Bye.